gilded age of the feast was always an illusion, a carefully constructed tableau of conviviality meant to mask deeper currents of ambition and dread. In the year 1350, at the heart of ducal splendor, every laugh felt manufactured, every toast carried the weight of unspoken alliances. Beneath the rich smoke of spiced incense and roasted meats, a more insidious scent lingered, a subtle, sickly sweet miasma that pricked the senses and settled uneasily in the back of the throat. It was an aroma foreign to true merriment, hinting at chemical manipulation just beneath the surface polish of high society life. A nervous whisper carried through the echoing halls. Talk of a potent draught circulated discreetly among those who sought advantage, or simply craved the oblivion from endless intrigue. This was not mere spiced wine meant to warm the blood. There were whispers that it possessed the unsettling quality of making conversation stumble, of drawing down eyelids until they felt impossibly heavy against the will. The tapestries themselves seemed to absorb this scent, a lingering, saccharine sweetness woven into the very fabric of power and paranoia. It suggested a deliberate effort to dull the edges of awareness, to soften the sharp points of wit and dissent before the gaiety could descend into genuine trouble. From the ornate pillars, where courtly flattery was exchanged, one could feel the pressure building, the need not just to celebrate, but perhaps simply to rest without drawing suspicion. The veneer of revelry was beginning to peel back, revealing a dark undertow powered by potent botanical secret. Even the brightest occasions, marked by candlelight and rich textiles, carry shadows of clandestine intent. The great ducal feast was not merely a celebration. It was a delicate theater of influence, where every gesture and sip of wine could signal allegiance or danger. As whispers had already alerted us to the strange, intoxicating scent, that sickly sweetness clinging to everything from the linen tablecloths to the very spiced vapor rising from the punch bowls, the undercurrent of anxiety remained palpable beneath the veneer of gaiety. The deepest anxieties, however, were not about public feuds or political maneuvering. They concerned something more primal: control. Control over perception, control over memory, and most critically, control over wakefulness. And as the hours bled into a decadent night, an insidious method of subjugation was subtly woven into the very fabric of medieval medicinal practice. We often view these historical gatherings through the lens of merriment and luxury, but we must also acknowledge the darker side, the systematic management of alertness. When power brokers gathered, when rivals, allies, and potential usurpers were forced together in a pressurized environment, the need to maintain order became paramount. And if order required temporary chemical intervention, that intervention was achieved through the oldest, most potent botanical secrets. The path to such knowledge often led not to the grand halls of the court physician, but into the secretive, sun-dappled corners of the castle gardens, where botany met black magic. Here lived herbalists, custodians of toxic beauty, practitioners who dealt in the volatile chemistry of the wild world. These individuals were privy to secrets that transcended mere remedy. They controlled consciousness itself. Consider Mandrake root. To modern ears, it sounds like Gothic fiction, a scream trapped within a tuber. But for medieval apothecaries, Mandrake was a deep source of power, associated with enchantment and potent soporific effects. Its very appearance was mythic. The woman who unearthed it risked not only physical harm, but the ire of ancient spirits. To possess such a root was to wield an almost terrifying degree of botanical control. It is in this context that Lady Alara, a noblewoman whose wit and counsel were highly prized at court, finds herself intercepted. It is far from the main revelry. It is in the hushed sanctuary of the walled garden, where the scent of night-blooming jasmine mingled uneasily with something muskier, earthier, the undeniable perfume of forgotten roots. The herbalist who approaches her does not speak of cures for fevers or aches. His focus is far more intimate. Nervous spirits, he whispers, a phrase which in this context can encompass anything from deep melancholy to simple overexcitement. He speaks of the pressures that accompany high station, the sleepless nights spent worrying over dynasty and debt. He presents her with a poultice, not of antiseptic herbs for drawing out infection, but one painstakingly crafted using roots and petals, whose volatile oils promised respite. The fragrance is immediate, heavy, cloying, yet subtly hypnotic, a scent that promises depth and oblivion in equal measure. Alara hesitates. Her eyes, accustomed to the dazzling flash of court intrigue, betray a flicker of deep unease. She knows, instinctively, that something about this mixture feels profoundly potent. The word sleep is freighted with more than mere rest. It carries the implication of forced compliance, of manufactured silence. This encounter speaks to a wider medieval understanding that excessive activity, whether through dancing, feasting, or political debate, could lead to an unsustainable state of hyperalertness. The remedy, therefore, needed to be deep, reliable, and discreetly administered. Mandrake, with its potent blend of sedative alkaloids, was a prime candidate for such botanical enforcement. The preparation itself demanded expert knowledge. The timing, the ratio of roots to carrier oils, the precise method of poultice application, all spoke to a systematic understanding of human pharmacology far beyond simple folk remedies. It was chemistry veiled in ritual, magic dressed as medicine. And this is where the true power dynamic emerges. Was Alara seeking genuine relief from nerves, or was she simply navigating the expected social offering? To accept it meant trusting the herbalist's judgment. To decline might mean being branded hysterical, unstable, or suspect, a dangerous failing in the high-stakes environment of a ducal court. The exchange is silent but monumental. The poultice represents not merely sleep aid, but temporary intellectual disarmament. It hints at a culture where deep rest was treated as a medicinal privilege, something to be dispensed by those who knew how to safely tap into nature's most powerful soporific agents. It was the perfect tool for the man or woman who needed their subject to simply shut down. The memory of that earthy fragrance now hangs in the air, mingling with the spices and perfumes of the feast. The whisper about the potion is confirmed by this hidden transaction. Before the general drugging of the main hall occurs hours later, these quiet, personal exchanges establish the precedent. Sleep aid is not an accident. It is a calculated commodity, available to those who know where to look, and potent enough to temporarily neutralize even the brightest spirit. The gaiety of the hall, once reaching a fever pitch, seemed to falter in an unnatural hush. The dance floor, moments earlier filled with drunken vigor and laughter, slowed as if swept by invisible hands. Here, amidst silks and candlelight, the subtle potency of powdered poppy began its work. An attending physician, masked by the trappings of service, moved through the periphery, his movements discreet and deliberate. He was not merely mixing wine, he was composing a draught of quiet submission. Into the grand ceremonial punch, designed to sustain the raucous rhythm of the feast, delicate pinches of finely ground poppy entered the liquid's swirling depths. The subtle aroma, which had been present throughout the evening, a sweet undercurrent beneath the spices and heady wine, now seemed amplified, imbued with a new soporific weight. This was not medicine for the ailing. It was an agent of social control, administered with the precision of an executioner's nod. Key figures were approached by the staff, the ducal retainers, the neighboring lords, the scholars whose sharp minds provided the intellectual veneer to the gathering. Each cup passed out seemed designed less for refreshment and more for sedation. As they drank, a visible shift occurred in the room's dynamic energy. The bright, witty repartee that had sparked earlier began to slow. Laughter became drawn out, punctuated by long silences. Sharp debates dissolved into agreeable murmurs. Where there had been fiery argument, now reigned a sluggish contentment. The powdered poppy worked its gentle magic, transforming intellectual sparring into mutual, drowsy acceptance. The vibrant colors of the clothing seemed suddenly muted under this chemical veil. This controlled deceleration was astonishingly effective. Within minutes, the intense energy that demanded constant performance began to recede, replaced by a deep, weighty languor settling over every soul present. The effect was not one of sickness, but rather of perfect, creamy exhaustion, a kind of peaceful stupor that smoothed out all edges of resistance. It made powerful men forget how sharp their thoughts could be, and it taught them, perhaps unconsciously, to accept the limits of their own endurance. The gaiety had been carefully muted, replaced by a comforting, manageable fog. To those who engineered this silence, the success was palpable. They had achieved not merely quietude, but a compliant state of grace, a collective readiness for repose. It was an orchestrated surrender, subtle enough to pass as overindulgence, yet potent enough to neutralize any genuine threat lurking beneath the surface veneer of high society life. The feasting concluded in a slow, pleasant decline, culminating not in riotous chaos, but in a hushed drift toward exhaustion, leaving the conspirators victorious among the semi-comatose elite. The feasting halls moments before had been alight with a dangerous energy, a mix of drunken abandon, potent wine, and adrenaline. The kind of wild merriment that usually leaves the morning after in fragments of regret and headache. But tonight, something else simmered just beneath the surface, a volatile tension fueled by ambition and residual suspicion. As the revelry began to fade into its natural, sloppy rhythm, the attention drifted out through the grand arches and into the outer bailey, a space designed for display and parade, now serving as an impromptu, overheated stage for conflict. The air here was cleaner than within the gilded walls, cut with the scent of damp stone and spilled ale. Here, away from the immediate gaze of the ducal family, a collision course had been set between two men whose interests were fundamentally opposed. One was Sir Callan, attached directly to the ducal guard, a man polished by wealth and bloodline, bearing the heavy expectations of his station. The other was a mercenary captain, hardened by foreign campaigns, carrying the brutal anonymity of coin-earned survival. A heated argument, initially whispered and dismissed as drunken banter among rivals, rapidly spiraled into something far more dangerous. Their voices rose above the echoes of departing music, fueled not merely by petty slights over spilled wine or misplaced honor, but by underlying resentments regarding power, ownership, and who truly served whom in this volatile duchy. The whispers, which had been enough to cause unease within the banquet hall itself, now carried a physical weight, threatening to derail the fragile peace maintained by the potent drafts. The outer bailey, usually merely a backdrop for grand entrances, suddenly became an arena. Knives were drawn, not in ritualized combat practice, but with jagged urgency, the metal scraping against stone as men adopted defensive and aggressive stances. The carefully curated atmosphere of controlled luxury fractured completely. This was not the measured violence of courtly dueling. This was raw, panicked physicality. The initial grappling quickly escalated beyond mere words or stylized thrusts. It became a desperate scuffle, a flurry of blows exchanged over perceived insults and disputed territory. Sir Callan found himself entangled with several other guards who arrived more out of professional reflex than genuine concern for the outcome. The mercenary, recognizing the advantage of superior brutality over courtly form, fought with brutal efficiency, prioritizing incapacitation over display. Blood began to wet the flagstones, turning the usually immaculate gray surface into a slick, darkening mosaic of conflict. The growing mess was alarming enough, but it threatened something far more valuable: the discreet maintenance of order that underpinned the entire celebration. The Duchess's attendance at the feast had been predicated on an illusion of absolute control, a temporary suspension of reality enforced by expensive wine and potent herbal influence. If this brawl spilled back into the main house, if it attracted undue attention to the unstable state of its primary participants, the fragile political balance would shatter. The chronicler watched from a discreet distance, his senses attuned to the rising chaos. The scent of blood mixed with sweat and adrenaline was a sharp contrast to the sickly sweet perfumes wafting from the banquet hall windows, a potent reminder that even in times of excess, the deeper machinery of control remained active. It was this rapidly deteriorating situation, the unsanctioned violence blooming in the outer bailey, that necessitated immediate intervention. The stewards and lower household staff, trained not in battle, but in mitigating catastrophic embarrassment, moved into action. They did not address the underlying conflict. Their concern was purely logistical, minimizing damage, removing witnesses, and restoring the pristine facade of ducal authority. The chronicler observed a subtle pattern forming amidst the struggle. As soon as the immediate threat level became unmanageable, when the scuffle reached a point where it would draw intervention from external forces or necessitate irreversible casualties, a change occurred. It was not an army arriving, but rather an organized retreat of control. Guards began appearing seemingly by magic, separating combatants with practiced roughness, whispering stern commands, and directing men away from the immediate vicinity of injury. This concerted effort to cap the violence suggested more than mere good intentions or basic peacekeeping measures. It indicated a prior calculation, a professional management of assets and liabilities. The brawl was not simply put down. It was contained, isolated, and effectively neutralized before it could taint the central operation of keeping the nobility compliant and subdued. The residual stain on the outer bailey stones, marking the passage of the violence, seemed to whisper secrets to the keen observer. The messy physicality contrasted sharply with the subtle, pervasive nature of the drugging agents, the Mandrake's suggestion of weakness, the poppy's promise of oblivion. Both required a deep understanding of human vulnerability. The chronicler realized that while the immediate spectacle was physical confrontation, the deeper drama remained one of unseen chemical and social control. The fight had been contained not by sheer manpower alone, but by an almost anticipatory precision, a professional removal of evidence, whether it lay in blood on the paving stones or residue in the apothecary's jars. conflict served as a jarring reminder. While the ruling class sought to subdue their rivals through luxury and potent sedatives, they were also fundamentally vulnerable to unrestrained emotion. The Brawl exposed the raw potential for chaos, making the sophisticated efforts of chemical placation seem not merely medicinal, but critically essential, a preemptive strike against the messy reality of uncontrolled human passion. The stench of rich wine, expensive perfumes, and sweat generally characterizes the lavish feasts of these powerful families. But beneath that veneer of glorious excess, there was a secondary scent, a cloying sweetness, almost sickeningly sweet, that seemed to cling stubbornly to the air and linger in the nooks of the stone halls. Throughout the preceding chapters, we have observed instances of subtle incapacitation. Mandrake poultices applied discreetly in quiet gardens, powdered poppy dissolving into ceremonial punches during raucous dances. The objective was always clear: control consciousness, dampen dissent, and ensure that even at the height of merriment, no true opposition could organize itself. The initial investigation had focused on how these elements were administered, the precise timing, the subtle movements of hand and service. But what truly remained elusive was the origin. The source remained a faint thread pulled through layers of scented drapery and polished wood. So, with lingering suspicions, our chronicler followed that faint, unnatural scent away from the main hall's gilded splendor, moving past the marble courtiers back toward the pulsating heart of the castle, the kitchens. The great industrial beast of the medieval kitchen was a chaotic microcosm, a place where immense resources were processed into transient luxury. It smelled overwhelmingly of burnt sugar and boiled fat, spices mingling with the acrid tang of coal smoke. Here, away from the judgment and scrutiny of the noble assembly, secrets could afford to breathe. The investigation led through labyrinthine passages designed more for function than aesthetics. The scent grew stronger here, becoming almost chemical in its intensity, suggesting not merely food flavoring, but something medicinal and highly potent. Our chronicler began paying close attention to the discarded waste, flaking residues on stone slabs near prep stations, empty ceramic jars stained with unnatural colors, scraps of parchment discarded carelessly by busy hands. It was here, amid the chaos of preparation, the rhythmic thudding of wooden mallets, the hiss of steam from copper pots, that the evidence became undeniable. These were not merely cooking materials. The residue found near a seldom used spice grinder looked suspiciously like crystallized nightshade, mixed with something powdered and pale. In a corner, tucked beneath a mound of linens that smelled faintly of aniseed and stale liquor, lay scraps of meticulously penned notes. They were written in the flowing script of an educated hand, a steward's hand, perhaps, or an apothecary employed by the household. The notes were fragmented, incomplete, but their intent was disturbingly clear. One section detailed a compounding formula requiring the deep sweetness for languor, listing powdered poppy alongside dried mandrake root, and what appeared to be licorice crystals used as a binder. Another entry referred specifically to preparation for high-spirited company and noted the necessary dosage to ensure deep, manageable rest. They spoke of neutralizing threats before they could manifest through drunken boasting or pointed whispers. The realization struck with the force of a physical blow. The chemical manipulation was not limited to mere social pacification. These mixtures were designed as preemptive measures against physical unrest. If an argument escalated in the bailey, the stewards knew how to dampen the adrenaline and slow the response time through careful application of compounds, keeping the conflict from breaching the main edifice's veneer of perfect control. The systematic nature of this procurement, the storage, the mixing, the recording, suggested a professional knowledge far exceeding that of a mere cook or scullery maid. This was the work of someone highly knowledgeable, privy to medicinal science, and crucially, empowered by authority to execute such controlled doses at will. The chronicler folded his hands around these damning scraps of parchment and crystalline residue, realizing the scope of the conspiracy. The potent drafts had always been presented as necessities, cures for nerves, tonics for digestion, or merely exotic flavorings for celebratory punches. But in reality, they were chemical restraints. They were invisible tools of social engineering, guaranteeing that even when the nobility was at their most vigorous and dangerous, they would never exceed a predetermined level of acceptable intoxication, a state best described by one word: manageable. Every sweet aroma, every telltale residue, whispered of a desperate control. It suggested not merely the need for celebration, but the deep, inherent fear that the wild passions of men, fueled by excess and ego, were constantly threatening to unravel the delicate political structure of the ducal house. The sedatives were less about ensuring sleep than they were about guaranteeing compliance, transforming potential revolt into a gentle, dreamlike submission. The air in the back chambers of the keep was thick with the scent of beeswax, old parchment, and the lingering metallic tang of spilled blood. All that night's gaiety, all the forced merriment of the great feast, had curdled into a tense, uncomfortable stillness. The initial shock of discovery, the discarded vials, the meticulous compounding notes detailing oblivion, had been replaced by a sharp, burning adrenaline of imminent confrontation. I found myself standing before Master Alaric, the apothecary, whose hands always smelled faintly of crushed petals and potent alkaloids. He sat at a low wooden counter, meticulously grinding pigments and dried roots into small porcelain pots, his movements as ritualistic and calm as if he were simply preparing spices for the morning meal. My evidence lay spread across an overturned tray, residue smears confirming the presence of poppy sap alongside mandrake fragments, formulae listing sedative dosages correlated with specific bloodlines at the table. There was nowhere to escape this confluence of meticulous calculation and terrible intention. I waited, letting the silence build, forcing him to inhabit my discomfort as surely as I inhabited his. He did not flinch when I spoke, his veiled eyes seeming to observe not me, but some far more distant, volatile point in history. His practiced composure seemed impenetrable, a veneer of professional indifference over something deeply manipulative and dangerous. It was clear that he was more than a mere preparer of poultices. He was a custodian of the realm's hidden peace, charged with ensuring that powerful forces remained dormant when they were most inconveniently awake. I laid out the truth of it gently but irrevocably. This wasn't simple medicinal care for troubled nerves. This was social engineering executed through botanical poison. The wine had been calibrated to dull confrontation, the punch, designed to dismantle intellectual sharpness, to ensure that rivalries, the kind embodied by those two knights in the bailey, could not spill into open conflict under the guise of celebration. He finally ceased his grinding, dusting the fine powder over a mortar with deliberate slowness. The gesture was less an action and more a dramatic pause before the inevitable judgment. A flicker crossed his face then, quickly masked, suggesting neither guilt nor surprise, but rather weary resignation. He finally lifted his gaze to meet mine, and in that look I saw not a merchant of remedies, but a professional observer of human weakness. With theatrical deliberation, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice until the words were barely whispers, requiring me to lean in just as much as him. It was not a confession, it was an admonition, a warning steeped in philosophy and necessity. He spoke of peace, not as the absence of conflict, but as a carefully managed state, a fragile equilibrium maintained by preemptive chemical control. He argued that the court, when left entirely to its own volatile passions, would inevitably descend into irreversible bloodshed, staining the royal lineage with unnecessary gore. The drafts, he asserted in these hushed tones, were merely subtle instruments of societal custodianship, ensuring that passion remained confined to polite, forgettable dullness rather than catastrophic reality. It was a chilling argument that controlled lethargy was preferable to messy revolution. He spoke of times long past, periods when conflict had torn the kingdom apart, entirely times where the mere roar of opposing ambition led to the slaughter of men and the dissolution of houses. In those histories, he claimed, moderation through oblivion had been the only balm strong enough to bind the warring ambitions of the nobility. The notion settled over me like a pall, that perhaps I was judging his actions with an overly simplistic moral framework, failing to account for the sheer weight of what it took to keep generations of proud, violent families from tearing themselves apart at the seams. His warning held a compelling, deeply disturbing logic. He suggested that true power lay not in open confrontation, but in the subtle manipulation of consciousness itself, in managing desire and temper before they could manifest physically. The implications were staggering. If history had taught him this lesson, if he truly believed it was necessary for the survival of the line, then his actions, while morally repugnant by modern standards, held a disturbing kind of protective utility within the framework of medieval court life. He dismissed my suspicions with a wave of his hand, treating the entire matter as one might dismiss an annoying gust of wind that threatened to disturb the delicate dust motes hanging in the candlelight. But those motes, I knew, were not mere cosmic debris. They were gilded remnants of stolen sleep, residues of political silence. The confronting nature of the truth was exhausting, stripping away any last vestiges of righteous indignation, and leaving only a cold realization that even peace itself could be chemically engineered, bought at the cost of genuine freedom. This encounter marked a critical turning point. I had confirmation of method and motive now. I needed to understand the scale of this carefully maintained deception, and who held the reins of this slumbering society. The whispers were over. The architecture of deceit was revealed in these shadowy back rooms. The apothecary's warning, delivered amidst the humid heat of the castle kitchens, echoed through the chronicler's mind like a poisoned whisper. The necessity of sleep, he was told, for the fragile stability of the court. But what peace was purchased by chemicals? What truth lay buried beneath layers of potent herbs and carefully administered drafts? The unlikely ally remained silent, observing the apothecary's retreating form, their gaze fixed on the faint trail of spice dust leading away from the hearth. It wasn't merely a conversation that had occurred here. It was a direction, a hint toward secrets deeper than the current investigation. The chronicler remembered an obscure mention, a fleeting passage in an ancient medical ledger, a reference to the forgotten royal stores, said to be untouched since the time of the First Duchy. If the apothecary knew where the secrets lay, perhaps he was willing to lead them there, even if only by proxy. A search for forbidden knowledge began. They moved away from the clamor and rich scents of the kitchen into the colder, more forgotten wings of the fortress, the subterranean passages leading towards the unused royal infirmaries. These were places designed not just for healing, but perhaps for containment. The air grew heavy down here, smelling less of exotic spices and more of damp stone and decay, a scent that spoke of things deliberately left to fade. The passage finally opened into a vast, disused storage vault, the repository of forgotten royal medicines. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the grime-coated windows high above, casting the cavernous space in a mottled twilight. Shelves lined the walls, laden with jars and boxes, brittle texts bound in hardened leather, mortars dusted with unknown powders, and rows of preserved botanical specimens that looked more like museum oddities than medicinal aids. The ally moved through the wreckage with practiced quietness, their fingertips tracing patterns on dusty wooden crates labeled with archaic scripts. The chronicler followed close behind, heart pounding against ribs that suddenly felt too exposed, too vulnerable to this profound secret. They were looking for confirmation of the apothecary's words, the source of unparalleled power. After what felt like an eternity of sifting through academic clutter and failed remedies, a subtle shift caught their attention. Near a secluded corner, almost swallowed by cobwebs and shadow, stood a massive oak chest. It was unlike the other furniture. It bore the weight of history and neglect, crafted from dark wood banded with tarnished brass, a clear marker of royal decree. The lock was intricate, resisting casual inspection. Working together, using implements that had been salvaged from an abandoned desk nearby, they painstakingly picked the mechanism. It yielded with a heavy, groaning sigh, releasing a gust of air that smelled intensely of dry lavender and powerful medicinal alcohol, a fragrance suggesting potency and deep age. The chest's contents were breathtaking in their gravity. They did not contain common poultices or mere dried roots. Within velvet-lined compartments lay vessels filled with crystalline liquids of unsettling colors: deep sapphire, milky jade, and vibrant amethyst. Alongside these potions, meticulously wrapped and preserved in oilcloth, were plant samples that the chronicler had only read about in fragmented histories, roots rumored to induce visions, petals whispered to halt the beating heart, seeds claimed to soothe the most rebellious mind. The realization struck them with the force of a physical blow. These were not just sleep aids, they were chemical tools of governance. Medicines designed not merely for cure, but for absolute and total control. The sheer scale and potency confirmed that the sedatives used at the feast were but minor cousins to what lay within this vault. The ally carefully lifted one of the scrolls accompanying the potions. It was a detailed pharmacopoeia, handwritten in a script that predated the current ducal line by several decades, charting complex compounding formulas, requiring ingredients both mundane and utterly forbidden. Every passage reinforced the dark truth. Power required an anesthetic veil, not just over the night, but over the spirit itself. Suddenly, their careful exploration was interrupted by a sound far more ominous than any creaking floorboard, the measured tread of boots. The oppressive silence fractured as heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing steadily closer. They had been discovered. The chronicler shoved the scrolls and samples into an empty satchel while the ally spun around, positioning themselves between the entrance and the hidden cache. A figure emerged from the gloom, not the apothecary, but a gaunt man in court livery, flanked by two heavily armed guards. His face was impassive, his bearing radiating a cold, professional authority that far surpassed mere palace security. This man spoke without raising his voice, yet every word cut through the stillness like polished steel. He knew they had been here. He knew what they had found. The moonlight filtering into the vault seemed to illuminate only their vulnerability and the undeniable weight of the secrets surrounding them. The confrontation was inevitable, standing at the precipice of a truth too potent, too dangerous for the light of day, or even the mercy of oblivion. The discovery in the royal vault had been breathtaking. An overwhelming arsenal of forgotten pharmacology, suggesting not mere occasional use, but deep-seated institutional control. The cache was indisputably potent, drafts formulated for millennia of keeping powerful minds silent or deeply unconscious. Yet, as the urgency mounted and the menacing figure outside continued to press their presence, the investigation shifted from broad conspiracy to razor-sharp focus. It was a matter of specific intent now. We had found the tools of coercion. We needed proof of who would bear them. The chronicler's attention zeroed in on the personal effects within the inner chambers, remnants carelessly left behind after a night of clandestine preparation. The air here felt different, thicker with unacknowledged danger, carrying only faint traces of sweet, unnatural herbs and powerful mineral dusts. Everything spoke of intimacy, the subtle creak of expensive wood underfoot, the scent of beeswax mingled with something acridly vegetal. The search was methodical, agonizingly slow, requiring an almost surgical patience. They examined embroidered linens and discarded vials, each object a potential piece of the puzzle that had been painstakingly assembled over days of fear and whispered accusation. The implications were immense. These compounds did not just subdue, they targeted specific constitutions, suggesting knowledge of individual weaknesses, fears, and habits. This was not merely social control at a feast. This was personalized management of powerful wills. Then, tucked away in the embroidered recess of a velvet-lined dressing cabinet, came an unexpected grouping. It was a cluster of objects, a small silver tray, polished to reflect nothing and everything alike, upon which rested several meticulously prepared implements. There were tiny porcelain vials labeled with archaic symbols, containing viscous liquids of startling shades, from milky white to deep amethyst. Beside these lay fresh medicinal poultices, still retaining the ghostly scent of crushed roots that had permeated the castle air. The chronicler felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool marble floor and everything to do with recognition. These items were not general stores, nor were they bulk reserves. They were precisely measured portions. The careful arrangement suggested an intended use, a dosage prepared for immediate consumption, requiring only proximity and access. The small tray held multiple poultices, some marked with the distinctive emblems of the inner circle, the ducal crest, the mark of a certain prominent guild, and subtly, the hidden signet used by the ruling family itself. Each pouch was fresh, waiting for its purpose, and lying prominently among them like a morbid calling card was an unmarked, pristine linen pillowcase. It was smaller than any regular bedding, clearly intended only for repose in a private setting. The implications struck with sickening force. This entire process, the drugged wine, the mandate of specialized sedatives, the systematic quieting of intellect displayed at the grand feast, was designed to ensure absolute silence and compliance within the very highest echelons of society. It was not merely about managing a party. It was about incapacitating strategic minds. The intended recipients were specific individuals who held positions of power, whose absence or altered state would guarantee the stability of the established order. The chronicler's gaze settled on a single, slightly larger poultice, resting almost deliberately near the edge of the tray. It seemed to pulsate with implied danger. He recognized the markings, not from the grand royal vault, but from obscure architectural diagrams detailing private sleeping quarters, a specific suite belonging only to one person of critical importance within the ruling structure. The realization was a devastating weight. The poison wasn't meant for a general audience. It was tailored, curated, and waiting in a designated space. It indicated a direct threat against an individual who had not been at the feast, or perhaps one who needed to be silenced asterisk after asterisk. The revelry concluded, ensuring that their consciousness could not challenge the imposed peace. This shift from general drugging, a collective sedation of the body and wit, to targeted preparation for a single person's sleep was profound. It changed the nature of the conspiracy from social management to calculated neutralization. The pillows were poisoned slumber chambers. The drafts contained not just forgetfulness, but absolute biological control. The air grew heavy with the unsaid confrontation. Every breath felt like an accusation. Whoever had laid out this scene of slumbering luxury and chemical deception understood that evidence was useless without context, and they had ensured that only the discovery itself could serve as damning proof. The immediate threat to the entire court was eclipsed by the undeniable, highly specific danger presented here. A carefully poisoned repose waiting for its intended victim. The weight of the evidence was suffocating, pressing down on them like a shroud woven from deceit and potent herbs. In the quiet intimacy of the hidden study, surrounded by artifacts that smelled faintly of feverfew and regret, there was nowhere for their secrets to hide. The apothecary, who had earlier dismissed their concerns with theatrical warnings about necessary stability, now found himself trapped between inescapable scrutiny and the weight of his own history. The fragile truce built on shared suspicion dissolved instantly under the pressure of irrefutable proof. Vials stoppered with beeswax, meticulously catalogued recipes, and the remnants of specialized blends that spoke not merely of medicinal care, but of absolute control. Their ally pointed out the discrepancies in the ledger, demonstrating how slight adjustments to the poppy ratio or the addition of an unexpected binding agent transformed a mild sedative into something far more potent, far more irreversible. The implication hung heavy in the air. These were not remedies for feasting nerves. They were instruments of incapacitation. The apothecary's composure finally began to fracture. His hands, which had previously moved with the practiced confidence of a master chemist, now trembled slightly as he refused to meet their eyes. He did not deny the truth outright, but instead retreated into a sophisticated veil of philosophy and political expediency. He argued that the grand spectacle of medieval court life was inherently unstable, a delicate edifice balanced precariously between soaring ambition and inevitable violence. In his view, true stability could only be maintained through the judicious management of consciousness itself, ensuring that volatile passions found an anesthetic reprieve. They pressed him on the targets, not just social unrest, but specific individuals within the inner circle who had been marked for silencing. The apothecary swallowed hard, finally recognizing the impossibility of maintaining his facade. He sank into a chair, the weight of years spent mastering such dangerous knowledge seeming to crush his shoulders. What followed was not a single confession, but a cascading torrent of justification, a chilling exposition on the maintenance of power. The revelry, he admitted, was a theater designed for survival, to allow uncontrolled ambition and raw, unmediated emotion to flourish at the height of pleasure was to invite catastrophe. The potent draughts were, therefore, not merely poison disguised as wine. They were political valves, opened only when necessary to prevent the court from tearing itself apart in mutual suspicion or outright battle. The whispers that had once seemed random, the falling curtain of laughter, the sudden slump in a noble's posture, were instead calculated doses administered by invisible hands. He detailed the motivations behind each dose, how one certain minor disagreement over succession could boil into open rebellion if left unchecked, how an overly spirited display of love or knowledge could suddenly turn fatal when political allegiances shifted. The sedatives, he argued with a grim certainty, offered a temporary reprieve from accountability. They allowed the court to indulge in glorious oblivion, forgetting their grievances and postponing the inevitable reckoning until a more opportune moment had arrived. It was management through chemical inertia. The true horror of his confession lay not in the act of drugging, but in the cold rationalization accompanying it. He presented himself as a weary gatekeeper, protecting the established order from the very excesses it celebrated. The sleep aids were portrayed as necessary tools against the inherent madness of high-stakes life. If one could control the mind, one could control the future, and that was, to him, the highest form of societal service. The revelation shifted the entire nature of their struggle. They were not simply investigating a crime, they were confronting a sophisticated mechanism of social engineering. The feast had not just been drugging an evening, it had been demonstrating the controlled potential for total systemic neutralization. Every laugh that sounded too loud, every moment of drunken vulnerability, now echoed with the weight of calculated administration. The silence that followed his confession was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of servants beginning to clean up the remnants of the feast, the careless scrape of a broom against stone, the clink of discarded glassware. It was the sound of order being restored, not naturally, but chemically imposed. They left the study with their hands stained not just with dust and ink, but with the residue of profound realization. The immediate danger had passed, yet the poisonous knowledge remained, settling deep into the bones of the court's memory. They understood now that the conspiracy was far deeper than a single bottle or one greedy hand. It was interwoven into the very fabric of power itself, a prophylactic measure built into the aristocracy's routine to ensure that even their deepest secrets would remain safely submerged beneath a manufactured slumber. Days bled into weeks, casting the shadow of that scandalous feast over every corner of the ducal court. The air, once thick with the cloying scent of poppy and mandrake, was now strangely brittle, a veneer of forced composure stretched taut by fear. The whispers had not ceased. They had merely lowered in pitch, settling into the murmurs exchanged across vast mahogany tables, conversations too low to be overheard, but potent enough to chill the blood. The evidence presented before the court council, detailing the targeted dosages and the sheer sophistication of the chemical control, was undeniable. It laid bare the artificiality of their society, revealing that their supposed conviviality was nothing more than a calculated performance, maintained by chemistry and fear. The initial outrage had been loud, spectacular even, punctuated by shouts of moral panic and accusations of treasonous poisoning, but beneath this immediate fury lay a deep-seated systemic tremor. The nobles were not merely offended, they were exposed. They had shown themselves to be dependent on these potent draughts, reliant upon the steady hand of the apothecary, the unwitting or willing gatekeeper of their collective slumber. The scandal did more than expose a crime. It exposed a vulnerability at the heart of the entire social order. The fallout was immediate and deeply disruptive. Public outcry demanded sweeping reform, especially concerning the medical practices and culinary traditions that had become so intertwined with political machination. Old remedies, once treated as time-tested wisdom, were suddenly suspect, viewed instead as potential weapons. The court physicians, previously untouchable arbiters of wellness, found their credibility shattered. They faced a reckoning, not just for administering potent narcotics, but for the implications of such controlled sedation on free will and genuine human interaction. The investigation into the origins of these sedatives broadened rapidly. It ceased to be a matter of merely arresting an apothecary. It became an inquest into the ethics of power itself. Scholars and lesser noble houses began questioning not just the drafts, but the very right of certain individuals, those few who controlled access to such potent natural compounds, to dictate the pace or even the awareness of others. Were these powerful plants, harvested from forgotten corners of the kingdom, to be used solely for keeping enemies unconscious, or should they serve a broader purpose, illuminating both healing and hazard? The changes implemented were swift and jarring. New councils were established, ostensibly dedicated to vetting medical knowledge, ensuring that remedies were administered with transparency rather than secrecy. Potions deemed too volatile, possessing sedative effects without clear therapeutic indication, faced severe restrictions or outright prohibition. Mandrake root, once a whispered symbol of deep slumber and potent mystery, became a subject of intense scrutiny, requiring verifiable sources and documented medicinal use to even be touched. But the institutional reform was not achieved simply by prohibition. It required a profound shift in mindset, a realization among the ruling class that true stability could not be bought or chemically induced. The fear they had harbored regarding internal dissent, the wild brawls of the outer bailey, the potential for intellectual confrontation at the high feast table forced them to seek alternative forms of social control. This was a pivot away from the immediate brute force of chemical incapacitation toward more intricate, if equally binding, behavioral mechanisms. The next generation of nobility began crafting new rituals of behavior. Instead of relying solely on the subtle haze of opium-laced punches to quell dissent, they implemented complex games of social favor and elaborate public displays of wit. Competition for intellectual superiority became paramount. The feasting table transformed, the focus shifted from mere excess to demonstrative brilliance. A nobleman was no longer judged solely by his wealth or lineage, but by his capacity to maintain sharp mental acuity through prolonged festivity, a challenge that required discipline rather than oblivion. Moreover, there was a palpable shift in how medicine itself was viewed within the elite circles. The line between therapy and control began to blur again, but with newfound caution. While powerful sedatives did not disappear entirely, they were too valuable, too potent, too essential to be eradicated from the medicinal lexicon. Their application became meticulously catalogued. Instead of being administered secretly in a punch bowl by a trusted, unseen hand, treatments started appearing, accompanied by ostentatious documentation and public consultation. The goal was always visible, transforming clandestine poison into acceptable cure. Yet the ghost of the drafts lingered. Every grand meal now carried an undercurrent of caution. When conversation became too lively, or when laughter stretched too long past its natural bounds, a veteran chronicler could still detect that subtle hesitation, the momentary lapse in mental sharpness that suggested not just wine-fueled glee, but something far more controlled. The knowledge gained in those days of revelation was this: absolute social peace is often achieved through the most subtle forms of chemical coercion. The legacy of the feast was a complex inheritance. It had forced an acknowledgement of systemic risk, compelling the powerful to build more robust, albeit equally manipulative, structures of conduct. They learned that merely putting their subjects, or indeed their peers, to sleep was only one tool in the arsenal of governance. The other tools included reputation, public expectation, and the carefully managed narrative of cultural superiority. The dark secret of those lavish banquets remained safely contained by layers of decorum and history. But for those few who looked closely, the chroniclers, the disillusioned servants, the surviving investigator, it was a stark warning. Power, it seemed, required not just armies and treasuries, but also a sophisticated understanding of human biology, proving that sometimes the deepest secrets are simply hidden within a root or